third grade. Today we worked with distributive property. Now, distributive property is a property of multiplication that can be used to take hard and difficult problems and make them easier. So we talked a lot today about what does distributive mean, the term distributive mean. So what we did is we took out the root word. The root word for distributive is distribute. So when you distribute something, you are divvying or splitting it up. So I want you to think about it like this. If Mrs. Gosnell had a stack of books yay high, and it was 10. It was like 10 heavy textbooks. And I was carrying 10 heavy textbooks. And I'm like, I can't do this. I need some help. I need help. My load is too big. It's too much. It's too hard to carry. Now, to make my load a little bit easier and a little bit lighter, I could distribute a book or two to my friend, and my friend can help me. And so instead of 10 books that I have to carry, I could probably cut that in half, or even cut 3 of the books off the top and give her 3, and I can carry 8, or I could give her 5 and I have 5. So instead of one heavy load, I distributed my load into 2 loads, 2 smaller loads to make the job easier. So that's what I want you to think of when you think of distributive property of multiplication. That it's something that we use when we see a problem that is unknown to us. Maybe it's a difficult problem that when we see it, we're like, oh, I always get stumped when I see this. We can use distributive property to figure it out. So in this case, we are going to start learning distributive property of multiplication working with arrays. So that's why we have been practicing our arrays and basically reviewing what we've learned in Unit 1. So looking at this array, the first thing you want to do is decide whether or not you have an unknown fact or a fact that you just can't do on your own, right? Just think about Mrs. Gosnell with those heavy books, right? So we're going to look at this and we're going to figure out, okay, what multiplication equation is here? Okay, what is being represented here? We use arrays to represent multiplication because it shows us equal groups using rows and columns. Rows go straight across, left to right, horizontal, and columns go up and down, vertical. Rows, columns. And we always said when we're reading an array, we think to ourselves, rows times columns, equal groups of. So our rows tell us our groups. So here we have 3 rows, 1, 2, 3. We have 3 rows. I'm going to write it right here. 3 rows. 3 rows of, remember that symbol only means equal groups of. It's all the multiplication symbol means. 3 equal groups of, how many's in each group? Well, how do you find that out? You look at the columns, count the columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 3 equal groups of 7. 3 equal groups of 7 is the same as saying 3 times 7. So let's say to ourselves, let's pretend that this is an unknown fact. And in our class, we can actually say it is because we haven't learned our 3s yet, and we haven't learned our 7s yet. We haven't learned strategies to attack those factors yet. So we could use distributive property, and we can take this hard problem, something that's unknown to us, And we can distribute the load, right? And make it easier. So what I'm talking about is looking at this array and splitting it in a way that it's going to be easy for us to solve it. So you need to think of, okay, I might not know 3 times 7, but I do know my 2's and I do know my 1's very well. So how can I split this array into 2 easier facts? So let's see. I could split it by my rows here. I can use rows. Let's see if I split the rows. If I take one of these rows and I split it here, let me get my, I split it right here. I'm going to split it like this. So what I did is I basically cut my array. I chopped it. I split it into 2. So instead of one big array, I have 2 smaller ones. And so now I know that if I find the product of this smaller array and the product of this smaller array, and I add those 2 products together, I will get the answer to 3 times 7. Let's see how that works. So I just took the array 3 times 7 and I split it into 2 easier arrays. So here are my new arrays. My new arrays are 2 rows of 7. That didn't change because I know I have 7 columns still. So I have 2 rows of 7 here. And down here, I have 1 row of 7. My columns didn't change at all. I split the rows up. I split the rows to make this fact easier. So my columns would stay the same. Notice that. I only split my rows. So I have 2 rows of 7 here and 1 row of 7 here. I know my 2's fairly well. I know that when I have a 2 as a factor, all I do is double the other number, right? So if I double 7, I will have 14. So I know this array up here equals the total amount of 14. And I know that identity 1 property states that any number times 1 will equal that number. So 1 times 7 is 7. Great. Well, that was simple, but now what? This is when distributive property of multiplication can be your best friend. So now that we made them simpler by splitting them up, we need to bring them back together. And so how do you do that? Well, I know that if I take the product here from this array and the product here from this little array and add them together, that's the same as putting my array back together. And that will give me the total amount. And that would answer 3 times 7. That was the problem that I started with. So let's see how that works. So I'm going to put it back together. I'm going to put my array back together. Okay, I'm ready. I have the answer. So I'm going to add 14 and 7. I'm going to add 14 and 7 together. How can you do that quickly? Well, that is up to you. You can line up your numbers and add them that way, or you can add up. So you could grab the bigger number, which is 14, grab it and say 14, and add up 7, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 21. So 14 plus 7 is 21, meaning 3 times 7 is 21. Because all I did was put my array back together again. So I'm going to go ahead and move my array back. So pretty much that is all I did. I'm going to move this equation down. I split my array up and then I put it back together again using addition. And that is what we call distributive property. We use the distributive property of multiplication to help us solve that problem, because the distributive property states that you can break apart a multiplication equation into two smaller equations, find those products, and then add those products together again, and that will give you the answer to your initial problem. So we're going to practice this again. So we're going to practice it another time. Now you can split the array in any way you like. The key is that you split it in a way that's easier for you. What facts do you know best? So let's look at this next array. So in this array, you could split this any way you like, whatever is easy. But the first things first, you need to find out, okay, what multiplication equation does this array represent? What does this represent? Let's find out. First, we have to look at the columns and look at the rows. Okay, so rows times columns, let's do it. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. 6 groups, 6 rows of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8. 6 groups of 8. Rows times columns, 6 rows, 8 in each row. All right, now is this a heavy load for us? Should we split it up and make our job easier? That's what you have to remember about the distributive property. It is used to make our load easier, right? These are unknown problems. So if we come to a problem we don't know and it's unknown to us, we know we could split this up. We could split this up and make it easier. So looking at this, how can we split this up? Well, that's up to you. What will be easy for you? Let's see, as third graders, you know your 5s super well. You know your 1s and your 2s. So you decide. You could easily split this array. You could split it by rows. You can split the rows, or you could split the columns. It doesn't matter. So let's see. If you split, let me go ahead over here. If you split the columns, going straight up and down, you could split it this way. Remember, we are splitting the array to make 2 smaller arrays. And when we put them back together again, it gives us that total amount. So when I split it this way, here I have, now my rows do not change. I still have 6 rows. I have 6 rows of 3 though this time. And here I have 6 rows of 5. However, do you know your 3s yet? Would that be the best choice for you? That's up for you to decide. But I wanted to show you that you could split your array by column. However, there's another way to look at this problem that I think is easier than 6 times 3 and 6 times 5. And that is splitting it by its row. So you could take this is the same array, and you could pull 5, because I know I have 6 rows, and I know my 5s really well. I can pull that array. I could pull 5 rows apart. I'm gonna split it up and have 5 rows of 5 rows of 8 instead of 6 rows of 8 because I took one off. So down here, I have 5 rows of 8. Now, the 8 is staying the same because my columns didn't change. I still have the same amount of columns. I just broke apart the rows because I thought that would be easier to solve. Because look at this next array that I made. I made 1 row of 8. So now looking at this, I want to still I'm aiming to solve for 6 times 8. I'm aiming to find the product of 6 times 8. And I am doing that by splitting up that problem into 2 simpler problems and then putting them back together again with addition. So I know my 1s. 1 times 8 is 8. And I know my 5s. I can count by 5s up to 8 and I have my answer. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. I could have even used my array to help me. So now here I have my 2 products and I'm ready. I'm ready to add those 2 products together so I can get the answer to 6 times 8. So all I'm going to do is put my array back together, and I'm going to do that with addition. So I know because of distributive property, I can take this 40, add it to 8, and that will give me the answer to 6 times 8. 40 plus 8, I'm just adding 8 ones to 40. That's 48. And to show you what that looks like in your picture, it's pretty much just putting the array back together again so I can get the total amount. Boom. That's all we did when we're adding. All we're doing when we're adding is we're reconnecting that array. Now, in your assignment, you have something that looks like this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Now, this is a simple problem, but I decided to use a simple problem to show you distributive property here so you can learn the concept, okay? Now, we know our 2s. 2 facts are not an unknown fact to us. We know 2 times 7. Fairly easy. But do we know distributive property? So if you come to a problem that you don't know, I recommend you using distributive property to solve the answer, but you don't always have to. This is just another tool for your toolbox. But I really want you to know this because this is going to help you in the 4th grade when math becomes a little bit more difficult, okay? So we want to be really good at distributive property. Even though we might know 2 times 7 like that, we want to make sure we know the distributive property of multiplication just like that. So looking at this simple math fact, how can we break this apart into even smaller units? So in your assignment looks like this. You are going to just be practicing today dividing up or distributing this array, okay? So I have an array that shows 2 times 7, 2 rows of 7. How can I make this even smaller, okay? So I have 2 lines here. I have a vertical line and I have a horizontal line because I want to give you a choice. You can decide to split it by columns or you can decide to split it up by the rows. That's up to you. Now, I'm going to show you both ways in my example. So looking at this, you could split up 2 times 7 right here in the middle. Boom. When I do that, I made 2. I took 1 array and made 2. It's like having an apple and cutting it in half. Instead of 1 whole apple, now I have 2. 2 pieces, 2 slices of the whole apple. Now I'm splitting the whole up and then putting it back together. So I just split up 2 times 7, and I made my array at the top here. My array above my line is one group, one row of 7. I was paused there and see if you would answer it before me. One group of 7, because I have 7 columns still. And I know that by just looking at this fact over here. If 7 is in my second factor, I know that that represents my columns. So I have one row of 7 plus, that plus sign is there just to remind us that we're going to have to add this back up again so we can get the answer to 2 times 7. So that's why that's there. Now, I also know that on the bottom I have an array that represents 1 times 7. Super easy, right? So I know that if I was to put these 2 pieces back together again, these 2 arrays, 1 times 7 is 7, and 1 times 7 is 7. I know that if I take 7 and 7 and add it together, I would get 14, and that would be my answer to 2 times 7. Let's look at another way we could have split this. Distributive property. Let's see. I can distribute it by the column. So I could look at this. Now, if it was easier for you, you could look at this and you could go, I know my 5, so I could split it and make it, I'm going to take 2 off, and that would be 2 rows of 5. Notice when you split it by column, your rows don't change. So on this side of my line, I have an array that shows 2 rows of 5. And on this side, I have an array that shows 2 rows of 2. And I know that 2 times 5 is 10, and 2 times 2 is 4. And if I take 10 and 4, add them together, I would get 14. So you have one of these to complete for your exit ticket today. You're only choosing one line. So remember, you can choose to distribute the array using your vertical line, or you could choose to do it using your horizontal line, which is here. So choose how you want to. Don't use both though. Choose how you would like to split your array and make 2 arrays instead of 1. Now, remember, distributive property tells us that we can distribute our multiplication math facts into 2 simpler facts and if we add them together, we would get the total amount. All right, I cannot wait to see your exit ticket and to see how you do with this.